Hey everybody, thanks for coming out to Faculty Garden tonight. As many of you know, this is a twist on our biweekly student creative writing reading series, which is called Word Garden. We love to have the opportunity for our creative writing faculty to read for you sometimes, and we know that we often are the audience for you, and we enjoy that, but it's good for us to put ourselves in the place of offering our works to you and making ourselves vulnerable the way so many of you do every 2 weeks on Thursday nights in the Murphy House. Thanks for coming tonight. This program is sponsored then by the Creative Writing Program, which in turn is sponsored by the Hendrix Murphy Foundation, Programs in Literature and Language. I'm Hope Coulter. I direct those programs and teach creative writing here, and I'll look forward to reading for you in a few minutes here. But first, Dr. Tyrone Jaeger, the director of the Creative Writing Program, will read first, so if his introducer would come forward.
I didn't know he was going to be behind me as I read this, so that's interesting. Okay. All right, so Ty invited me to introduce him here tonight by reminding me that since I've been in class with him more than any other student currently at Hendrix, it's only right that I take this opportunity to, and I quote, get revenge. Now, I don't know if I would use the word revenge, but I will say that not only have I been in at least one class with Ty almost every semester since my sophomore year, but he's also my academic advisor, thesis first reader. He's been my supervisor for several Odyssey projects. I cannot get rid of this guy. I spend almost as much time in his office as I do in my own apartment. And yesterday, here's a fun fact, when telling our thesis class about this reading, Ty tried to describe the story that he's about to read by telling us this long-winded story about a time he was in Florida and this strange woman started ringing the doorbell of the house that he was in, and then a drunk woman stumbled in and screamed about this man who was after her with handcuffs. And the story went on and on for a really long time, and then finally he leaned back in his chair and he said, "But that doesn't have a whole lot to do with the story I'm writing." So I have no idea what you're about to hear. And that's another thing about Ty, is that I don't know if I've ever seen him not leaning. He's got this careful quality of carelessness. Like, he's not a regular professor, he's a cool professor. He swears in class, but not too much. He wears flannel. He wants you to call him Ty, not Dr. Jaeger. And I've heard this speech many times. I know you've been trained to call your professors by whatever qualifications they may have, but I encourage you to just call me Ty. I prefer it. And I may poke fun at him a lot, I'm sorry, Ty, but he's also a great professor and an incredible mentor and a constant source of calm who has talked me down from the edge of panic on more than one occasion. And I trust him enough to constantly ask for advice about my future, even if I sometimes disregard that advice. And no, I did not apply to Nebraska Lincoln's graduate program. He was on sabbatical my freshman year, and I barely even knew that he existed until the spring of my sophomore year. But I mean it when I say that I cannot imagine the writer or the person that I would be today without him. Thank you for everything, Ty. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Dr. Tyrone Jaeger to the stage.
Thanks, Ellie. That was good. I mean that. But hey, am I leaning? Along with thanking Ellie, I also want to thank the Hendrix Murphy staff, Henrietta, Sarah, Hope, all the Murphy kids for all the work they do to help events like this occur. Of course, thank you all for coming. I'm very excited to read with Hope and Elizabeth. I was really uncertain about how I was going to introduce this story, if I was going to introduce it in the way that Ellie just did, which is awesome because now I don't have to make that choice and I can just sort of go right into it. The story set in Florida near this street, Orange Blossom Trail, the OBT, excuse me. And if you know anything about Orlando and the Orange Blossom Trail, it's a pretty shady street, lots of prostitution and drugs, though none of that is in what you're going to hear. And neither is what Ellie talked about. You're not going to hear any of that. These are earlier sections in the story. And this story, in the spirit of vulnerability, is new. It's not even finished. I'm going to read the first two sections. When we're done and signing books, if anyone has books to be signed, you don't have to get a book signed, but if you want to talk to me about this in-progress story, that would be awesome. Okay. It's either called the Orange Blossom Trail, or the Orange Blossom Suite. 1, my father. Under the pretense of celebrating my father's 60th birthday, I traveled to Florida to visit a woman who happened to be the younger sister of someone I briefly had been involved with during college. During my week-long stay, I only spent 2 days with Claire, and despite our long-distance flirtations, now that we were in one another's company, her interest in me, or more accurately, her interest in a relationship with me, ranged from subdued to non-existent. Oh, I should say too, as a preface, I think this story is going to be funny, but there is as yet no evidence in the story to prove it as such. So the interest ranged from subdued to non-existent. I was flying home the next day, feeling unwanted, like a stray you see sniffing in the ditch off the highway. We were sitting in a row, me, Claire, her mother, and her sister, on the screened back porch having drinks. And the plan was that after dinner out, we would settle back at the house and watch a space shuttle launch. Claire lived with her mother, Natalie, in one of those ever-expanding subdivisions for which they would eventually raise the remaining orange groves. But this was before the groves were pulped, and the backyard of her mother's house opened up to row after row of orange trees. In the throe of spring, the heady scent of the blossoms delivered me to another dimension. Sweet and orderly were those groves. I was in my early 30s, and maybe this is what I hoped for Claire and me: sweetness and order, a pardon from the sentence of an extended and messy youth. Claire was excited and telling the story about what had happened when she dropped me off at my father's a week ago, a story for my benefit, I assumed, for it would seem a story she would have already shared with her mother and sister. And then there were these 3 wiener dogs running around the house like circus animals, yap, yap, yap. So I started barking and chasing them, cracking myself up really when I hear, and then she put on this cartoonish German accent, Dachshunds! Dachshunds! Claire laughed so hard she snorted, and this caused her sister to laugh maliciously. Claire's sister, the one I had been involved with, went by Deborah, though I had known her as Debbie. Natalie, their mother, offered me a face full of pity. When I was introduced to her, I called her Mrs. Holdaway, and in a measured manner she replied that it was Dr. Holdaway. But since I wasn't her patient, Natalie would do. Claire, still punctuating her laughter with snorts, touched my knee and said, "You tell it, I can, it's too much." She quieted and covered her mouth. Deborah leaned back in her chair, basking in my humiliation, and the sweetened order I had imagined moments before shifted. In my mind's eye, I pictured a long saw blade and the trees falling one after the other. Still, I did as asked and explained how squirrels had been ravaging my father's bird feeders, so he took to shooting them with his BB rifle, and then what he thought was a covert manner, he would walk out to the feeder, drop a paper bag at his feet, stuff the dead rodent in its funeral vestments, and bury it in the backyard. His nosy neighbors, Larry and Linda, bore witness to his gunplay, and soon he received a sternly worded letter from the homeowner association. Dad's solutions was the dachshunds, once bred for their ability to hunt burrowing creatures. The dachshunds, however, proved ineffective unless he first maimed the squirrels. Claire, Deborah, and Natalie stared, not trying to mask their low-level horror. I said, "He just really loves birds." I paused, knowing this wasn't the story they wanted to hear. So I began again with how we arrived at my father's house and how it didn't seem like anyone was home. Claire chased the dachshunds around the house, and we heard my father, who she had yet to meet, call for them as he does, as if they were a single beast. My father claimed that his dog whisperer had trained them as a unit, and they only answered to German commands. When Claire and I heard my father bellowing, "Dachshunds! Dachshunds!" we followed his voice through the kitchen and to the door leading to the attached garage. My father shouted, "Sitz!" And we turned the corner to see the 3 dogs shaking anxiously, but sitting in a circle around my father, who was holding a socket wrench in one hand and a weed eater in the other. He was wearing nothing but a John Deere cap and an apron tied about his waist, one buttock facing us. "My fuel line's gummed up," my father said, shrugging. "My spark's gone out." Claire and I stood, confused and unmoving in the doorway when my father said, "Dachshunds!" bringing the dogs to attention. "Hop, hop, hop," he said, and the dogs stood on their hind legs and hopped in a circle around my father. He stood smiling like an overgrown and disrobed wood gnome. Claire grabbed onto my arm. My father said, "It's good to see you, son." He grabbed an orange from his workbench. He had grown 3 trees from cuttings and tossed it to me. Claire heard my father's wife in the kitchen and darted away. My father removed the apron, lit a cigarette, and with a plastic grocery sack in his hand, followed his dogs out into the backyard. To Claire and her family, I said, "Someday it'll be all mine. Circus dogs, squirrel hunting preserve, and nudist retreat, my legacy." No one laughed. "I quit some years back using hypnosis," Natalie said. "Small engine repair in the nude," Claire said. "Smoking," Natalie frowned. "I quit smoking. I'd be happy to give you a number to share with your father." "I'm not sure he's the type for hypnosis," I said, "but sure." I didn't tell them that when my father exited the garage, the sun shone in the backyard at such an angle that he was backlit, and an orb of bright light surrounded him, all filtered through cigarette smoke. And he looked like he was being born into a state of shattering grace, stepping with no resistance into the arms of his creator. But with this vision came the sobering thought that this naked fool, my father, would die. And I was brought to my knees, nearly brought to my knees with this fact. My father, my only father, will someday die. And I thought, what will be all the things that we will have left unsaid? All the things, I thought. It will be all the things. The orange he tossed me, I still have it, shriveled and hard as a stone, buried in a box with some photographs. 2, the older sister. At the beginning of college, Debbie and I had projected versions of ourselves onto one another, but these were like trailers for films that never made it to production, imagined selves. We met sitting on someone's dorm room floor, and in a beery whisper, she told me that her godparents owned Sunbeam Bread and that her little sister, Claire, was the inspiration for the smiling butter-haired girl on the package. Later, I mentioned this claim to a friend, and only then did I realize how preposterous it was. Maybe she was testing my gullibility. Did I fail, or did I pass? There was a month or 2 that we slept together, whether in her dorm room or mine, and we would have whispered conversations, hoping our roommates asleep. During one of these confessionals, she told me how she had an older sister who had been born with a congenital defects of the kind you couldn't imagine. The baby was institutionalized. Debbie had never met her. I imagined a hospital of horrors and a family with a monster-shaped hole in it. One night, she and a girlfriend decided to go bar hopping. I insisted on tagging along, although it was obvious they were hoping for a girls' night. We were not of age. Debbie had a fake ID she had made using her deformed sister's birth certificate. I had doctored my driver's license with whiteout and a lead pencil, and it looked a crude forgery in all but the dimmest light. We primed ourselves at a local dive, and then the girls decided they wanted to go to the Booby Trap, a strip bar down on Orange Blossom Trail, infamous for its suggestive architecture, which I personally thought looked more like a pink double scoop ice cream sundae. Long story short, the bouncer glanced at my ID and told me to take a hike. "Come on, Debbie," I said. Having never been in a strip bar, I was somewhat relieved at being shooed away. "Debbie?" the bouncer said. "That's not what it says here." He held her ID aloft. "Asshole," I said, quietly, regretfully, as much to myself as to the bouncer. He spoke into a walkie-talkie clipped to his shirt, and from nowhere appeared a uniformed cop. In the back of the police car, Debbie said, "You are a feeble-minded idiot." I'm not sure that she spoke to me again for several years. It would become painfully obvious to me that Debbie orbited in social circles high above my own. My circle was so pitifully small, it wasn't so much an orbit as an axis of fools spinning themselves nowhere like a brood of barbershop poles. Now, over 10 years later, Deborah still loathed me and was suspicious of the attentions I had showered on her sister, suspicious of my visit to Florida. I have no idea what she knew. None of it amounted to much. Claire and I had been exchanging long-distance phone calls and writing letters, cryptic missives coated with absurdities meant to signal affection. You know how it is. You imagine yourself a planet sending out satellites to make contact, and then one day you realize you're not a life-filled planet, but more like an asteroid, a chunk of rock sailing through the vacuum of time. My hope, I realize now, was that Claire and I would collide, and she would complete me somehow. But there I was, easing into the kind of loneliness that has its own fearful symmetry. Tiger, tiger, burning bright, and all that. Perhaps you too have moments where you think, I used to laugh more than I do now. And where exactly, little lamb, did the laughter go? Thanks.
Hello, my name is Layla Zaidi, and it is my pleasure to introduce to you Hope Coulter, Professor of Creative Writing and the Director of the Hendrix Murphy Programs in Literature and Language here at Hendrix. Originally from Louisiana, Hope earned her undergraduate degree at Harvard and her MFA at Queen's University at Charlotte. Hope is a novelist and a poet, and I've also heard she's published a children's picture book. Is that true? That is so cool. In 2015, Hope published her first collection of poetry entitled The Wheel of Light. Beyond her accolades and publications, however, Hope is an observant, thoughtful individual who, in my experience as a person, professor, and writer, has a keen eye for detail, both on the page and in nature. At the end of my spring semester of my sophomore year, I had the opportunity to visit the Buffalo River region with 3 professors, including Hope, and a dozen other students. During some downtime one afternoon, Hope took a few students on a butterflying adventure. Despite how innocent identifying butterflies seems, I was pretty nervous. For some context, a few days beforehand, Hope and her husband Mel took our entire group on a bird-watching adventure. It turned out I was pretty terrible at it. And I'm really sorry, Hope and Mel, if you're in the audience, I did not really enjoy it. I felt pretty embarrassed about this, considering that both Hope and Mel have traveled around the world to go birding. I would estimate that they have checked hundreds of birds off their list. So after this experience of birding with them, I hesitantly went on this butterflying excursion with Hope. While on the trail, we paused and felt a rush every time we noticed wings in our peripheries all along the bushes. We would jump to grab our binoculars, pause, and then follow these bouncing color swatches on wings. With Hope's encouragement, genuine joy, and her patience with my dozens of questions and rushing to grab the field book and then rushing back to the binoculars, She was extremely encouraging, and I eventually found the activity to be a sort of meditative exhilaration. I realized by the end that the act of chasing butterflies had caused me to pause and take in so much more of my surroundings: the bushes, the leaves, the trees, the rising and falling of laughter of friends, and the moments of contemplative silence. In many ways, Hope's appreciation for observing nature is evident in her work, whether she's writing of scenes in cities, describing childhood memories, or writing of life and death, as she does all of these things in her book and in her other works. She expresses both exhilaration and patience, the sharp, intricate voice of a poet and the tenuous voice of an ordinary person. Just as Hope pays attention to the minute, nuanced details of nature and her world, she also playfully obscures experience in order to give us a more complex portrayal of emotion and memory, as any good poet should do. I hope you enjoy listening to Hope read tonight. Please join me in welcoming Professor Coulter.
Thank you so much, Layla. I love the time that I spend with students in the classroom and in the Murphy house, and sitting and talking in my office, but I really loved that trip on the Buffalo and those minutes on the trail, hours hanging out by the river. It was really special, but thank you. And thank everyone for coming tonight. I really appreciate it. And as Ty said, none of this would happen without our wonderful staff. Sarah and Henrietta keep everything running smoothly at Murphy. So as has been mentioned, I am a birder. That came about because of my mother, when she was in the 4th grade in 1937, went to Ouachita Parish Grammar School in Monroe, Louisiana, and her 4th grade teacher was crazy about birds, and the kids did a unit on birds. I think they may have even kind of focused on birds all year long, and my mother got interested and transmitted that interest to us, and so now I'm a birder. I met my husband through birding, and some of my nieces are birders, and my little great-nephews, who are 6 years old, are passionate about birds as well. So I love thinking about that because it reminds me of how far-reaching a teacher's influence can be. That one woman in 1937 made a choice about her classroom that has had all these ramifications for my mother's life, my life, and our family's life. And I think about that when I go about the enterprise of teaching. So when I was growing up, my mother, we saw a lot of neat birds in our yard and around Alexandria where I lived, but twice a year we would go down to the coast of Louisiana and attend the weekend-long meetings of the Louisiana Ornithological Society. It's a very weird landscape there in southwest Louisiana, the extreme southwest part of the state. It's the most sparsely populated parish of Louisiana. Marshes everywhere, oil rigs, very strange birds. Beautiful birds are there all year long. And in spring, the migrants come across the Gulf, migrating from Central America, and they just drop down into the woods there on the coast because they're exhausted from flying across the Gulf of Mexico. So you can see scores and scores of birds. So we would go and look at these, and then we'd come back, and when I was in about 10th grade, I took off on a Friday to do this excursion with my family. And so on Monday morning, I had to bring a note to school. The procedure at my high school was you brought a note from your parents, and your homeroom teacher would read it, and then she would sort of translate it into the official check of, what was the reason for your absence, checked off of a grid, and then you got this blue slip to carry around all day. So my mother always went a little overboard with these notes. She would write them on her best stationery, which was way too much for my high school, but she would formally write out this note on her monogrammed note card, and this time she wrote, "Dear Mrs. Lee, please excuse Hope's absence on Friday. She went with me to attend the meeting of the Louisiana Ornithological Society." So Miss Lee, who was also my typing teacher, looked at this note, and she had her blue slip poised to make the check mark, and she looked at me and said, "Do you want me to just say you were sick?" It's not the last time that someone would conflate birding with an illness. Just ask my children. Anyway, my husband and I we do go birding on our trips, and last spring break we went to Costa Rica. I have never been to Costa Rica before, and so virtually every species we saw was going to be new for me. But my husband had been there several times, and so he was in search, in particular, of the elusive snowcap, which is a hummingbird, tiny, tiny even for hummingbirds. It's magenta, it's metallic magenta, and it has, Allison's nodding, it has a white top of the head. So we went to a birding lodge, yes, such things exist, where there are a lot of trails on the property. They cater to birders, and yes, the snowcap comes there. We dumped our bags in our room and immediately took off on the trail that was marked Hummingbird Pools this way. I expected that the hummingbird pools might be at eye level. We'd seen things like this in other places where you hang out there for just watch for the hummingbirds to come. But to my surprise and somewhat my disappointment, the viewing platform was over this ravine. We were looking way down at this creek. I was like, what's this about? This is kind of strange. There was a giant man there with an even more giant camera, waiting in utter silence with his camera pointed down to the creek. So this gave me some clue that something was about to happen. And anyway, I'll tell you in the poem what we eventually saw. The poem starts with a description of the locale, and that's kind of key to why this viewing platform was arranged where it was. So anyway, Hummingbird Pool, Rancho Naturalista. The afternoon sun picks its way down the ravine, chasing a creek that drops down the steep slope, past fern banks and spits of silt, finally pooling behind a log where the sun catches up and tags it and bathes it in light and lingers. When out of the woods zooms a spark of iridescence, barreling into the clearing and hovering herky-jerky over the sunny pool. Between its blurred wings, see the small thumb of its body. As it treads air, see the flickering purple glaze down the back. As it turns, see the eye, the needle bill, the glittering green chainmail of its breast. It plunges, tail first, straight down, immersing itself to the neck, then rises, tail furiously scooping water, then air, makes a quarter turn, drops again. Over and over, it dips, lifts, turns, purple, indigo, lime, then shoots away into the forest, whose darkness is noncommittal, till, from the opposite bank, a dazzling bullet with slender pointed wings, tail feathers spread like a starburst, sinking, rising, a tiny gleaming plunger surrounded by rings of ripples whose beat urges the dipping, turning creature to its finish and into the wings to cue the next metabolic gemstone, airborne bather, Olympic whirler over water, not ice. I would beat my palms bloodless, but for fear the applause would scare you into the gloom forever. Instead, I hail you with the thunder of a soundless roll call. Crowned wood nymph, purple-crowned fairy, magnificent hummingbird, purple-throated mountain gem, green-crowned brilliant. So obviously I also love the words of birding. I love the species names. And the poem is about something that poetry is also about, which is trying to find a name for the things that you see. And by the way, yes, we did see a snowcap, but that's the one word that was not as mellifluous, so it didn't make it into the poem. So another experience later in the trip exemplifies a theme that recurs in my poetry, the ubi sunt theme. You Latin scholars will know that means, where are they? And it's that haunting question, where is everything that used to be? The snows of yesteryear, those things I remember so vividly from my childhood, those people, how can they be gone? This poem is about that, and it's also about language itself and the effort to communicate across languages when people don't have an immediately accessible common language. So this vignette is from more like central Costa Rica, not that far from San Jose. It's called Three Old Men. 3 old men at the butterfly garden, one with glasses and wearing a light blue hat, one with a tucked-in shirt, holding his shoulders back like a soldier, and one in a windbreaker taking pictures. Their progress is slow down the path. They keep stopping to talk, scanning the hillside, with thoughtful smiles spreading and fading across their tan-creased faces. Halt, old gents, like veterans back at a battlefield, or gallants bemused by a long-ago dance floor. Their faraway eyes fall on us, buzzed by hummingbirds, squinting over the field guide. And when we look up, we're caught in one of those moments that happen sometimes among strangers who find themselves joined by crossing paths, beholding some passing scene. We murmur greetings, they start to ease by, when on impulse, the hatted one speaks. "Hablas español?" I point at my husband, whom Hat now addresses. "Nosotros," pushing his glasses up, drawing an airy circle around his friends and him. "Nosotros," something, then casa, that I know, wait, have, had, past tense, a day, no diez, he's holding up all his gnarled fingers. "We had a house here 10 years ago, and then terremoto." The house was remote? My husband and I throw guesses as the old men look skyward, vexed and laughing in this impromptu game of charades, casting about for the words that will make us see. We had a house here once, and 10 years ago it was. Hat spreads his hands flat, smashing air, just as my husband says, "Earthquake." They pump their heads, yes, yes, everything gone. Nodding, eyes alight. A football field over there, the vegetable patch. And now, he shakes his head. Fond memory. They make their way on down the path, beside the engineered creek and the plantings that draw the winged things that draw tourists out of the buses yonder, parked at the roadside cafe. 3 old fates, moving now to the souvenir shop, venturing over the threshold, stepping into the gloom where a sales girl, perched on a stool, yawns over earrings fashioned from bits of lava, which glitter less than the hummingbirds in this trembling, improbable world. Thanks. And this final scene is a glimpse we had from the car somewhere in the outskirts of San Jose, the capital. It's called Education. Children with satchels and backpacks crowd the dirt paths beside the road. The older ones go in 2s and 3s, sweaters tied over their shoulders, and younger kids walk with their elders, mama with baby on hip, papa intent in his khakis, striding toward the crosswalk, and long-skirted abuelita with her pinned-up braid, stepping along beside her charge. A peal of laughter, dust spumes, girls frown, and a snaggletooth boy races to catch up with friends as faster and thicker the human stream pours toward the edifice visible now, looming behind the hedge. At the corner, a stout old lady grasped the arm of a wheeling white-shirted boy. With her free hand, she thumbs a firm cross in the air. Just as he twists away, successfully scrambling out of her grip and off to school, leaving the blessing to float unlanded, to mingle with vapors of flowers and diesel fumes on the suddenly empty avenue. Thank you.
break that. Okay, hi. So Elizabeth asked me to introduce her tonight by pointing out that I have been in her class every semester since my sophomore year, which I had realized. But what I hadn't realized is that I am the only student she has had every semester since she came to Arkansas. So fall semester, my sophomore year, I signed up for her sort of introduction to poetry writing class because I thought poetry would be easy and fun to write. And I really just needed to fill an empty spot in my schedule for that semester. But what I hadn't anticipated was how challenging writing actually is. And I hadn't anticipated that I would enjoy it as much as I do. And since that semester, nearly every creative writing class I've taken here at Hendrix has been with Elizabeth. And we've known each other for nearly 2 years now. And in that time, she's become a sort of mentor to me, constantly inspiring and challenging me to grow and push myself as a writer. Which I know I've mentioned poetry a lot in this introduction, and Elizabeth is something of a poet. She actually has 2 poetry collections, one of which is coming out this October. But when she asked me to introduce her, she said she might be reading an essay tonight, which she told me she hasn't done since her graduation from DARE, the Drug Abuse Resistance Education Program in the 5th grade. So everyone, please join me in welcoming Professor Elizabeth Rogers to the stage.
I've been this way my whole life. I can't help it. Okay. Thank you guys for sharing the stage with me. And thank you to everybody for being here tonight. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay. Thanks, Michelle, for introducing me. As Michelle pointed out, I haven't read an essay in public since 1996 when I was in the 5th grade. So this is going to be something of a new experience for me. So I'm just going to read a portion of an essay tonight. It's an autobiographical essay. When I was in high school in North Carolina, my high school every year had a beauty pageant. And not the Miss Hendrix variety, but an actual beauty pageant. This is a coming out story set inside a rural beauty pageant. The pageant becomes this kind of like terrible arena, right, where really serious issues actually, race and class and gender kind of get explored. The essay is quite long. I'm just going to read the first few pages and then the last section of the essay. It's called Miss Southeast. Late February in North Carolina. Hormonal daffodil-spewing days alternate with days of cold, slobbering rain. All winter long, the white girls have made regular visits to the tanning bed. The backless dresses hang in closets, waiting. At our rural county high school, this time of year brings out the worst in everyone. Not so much because of the weather, but because it's beauty pageant season. It's not a beauty pageant, the treasurer tells me for the upteenth time. It's a scholarship competition. We are having a student officer meeting in condo number 2, one of the trailer classrooms behind the real school building. The treasurer has just agreed to direct this year's spring's pageant, which means that the rest of us, thank God, are mostly off the hook. She actually won when she competed last year, so she'll be able to anticipate everything before it even happens. I think back to the treasurer's winning performance. Between the typical pop song renditions and flashy dance numbers, she had emerged on stage wearing a peasant blouse and a long skirt, a white kerchief tied around her head. Her voice, normally small and nasal, seemed to have grown overnight, carrying Sojourner Truth's famous convention speech to the back of the auditorium. "I have as much muscle as any man," she proclaimed, pulling back her sleeve and flexing her bicep in an exaggerated, jokey way. The audience laughed. "You need not be afraid to give us our rights," the treasurer insisted, "for fear that we will take too much." Every so often, she threw her hand on her hip, punctuating her speech with a refrain. "And ain't I a woman?" she asked the crowd, her voice trumpeting through the dark. As I watched her perform, I wasn't thinking so much about women as I was about how the treasurer was a black girl, and how Sojourner Truth had been born a slave. How our classmate, Brandon, had recently been sent home from school for wearing a Confederate flag belt buckle. How Haley, a white girl on the cheerleading squad with the treasurer, had recently told me that her father was, of course, completely fine with her having a black best friend, but that he'd bury her alive in the yard if she ever got engaged to a black boy. These things made me ashamed, and I made a resolution then to try and go as far as possible away for college, as if bigotry didn't exist outside our corner of the country. At the end of that pageant, the treasurer stood posed in her backless silver dress, not fully cognizant that the judges had just announced her name. Despite her relative popularity at school, you could tell by the odd, unpracticed motions of her face that she wasn't expecting to win. But the crowd was cheering crazily. She hesitated as she started her victory walk down the runway. No one said it out loud, but it was probably the first year in school history that the pageant winner wasn't a white girl. At the runway's end, she stopped and smiled demurely, looking down at all the hands raised around her. Now, in my junior year of high school, I'm the student vice president, the officer with the vaguest responsibilities. It is in this spirit, perhaps, that I am involved with this year's pageant, as a distant sort of ceremonial leader, which, as we learned in U.S. history class, is what you call your executive when he needs to show up for some nameless moral or social reason, but not actually to do anything useful. When I arrive at the dress rehearsal, the plywood runway still looks pretty rickety. Some boys are working to reinforce it. My friend Maya is with them, an actual hammer hanging from the carpenter loop of her overalls, her spiky brown head bobbing up and down as she surveys her progress. She's not even in student government. "Who enlisted Maya?" I asked the treasurer. My verb choice suggests my true feelings about the pageant. The treasurer, who was working on last-minute choreography with the girls, looks at me suspiciously. "Maya said you were stressed out about all this," she replies. We both know my stance on the pageant, that I've done very little to help. She says she's here to help you out. From across the auditorium, I see Maya pick up the staple gun, working to attach some fabric and a long garland to the edge of the plywood. The runway looks like a gaudy sheet cake and stretches over the stage pit and the first few rows of the auditorium, sacrificing a few center seats. I sidestepped towards her through one of the auditorium rows. "Hey," I said, "I didn't know you were helping with all this." "Oh," Maya smiles, swaggers a little. "It's cool." She runs her hand through the back of her hair, which is about an inch long. Since last year, I've watched her go through a slow evolution, ditching the paperback Bible she used to carry at all times, replacing her contact lenses with black-rimmed glasses, and her ponytail with shorter and shorter cuts. I loved the haircut before this one, but this current haircut makes me sort of nervous in a way that I can't explain. A few times in public, I've seen people mistake her for a boy. "How are you holding up?" she asked me, as if I've recently experienced the death of a loved one. I motion towards the stage where the girls keep getting confused about the choreography, intercepting one another like frightened gazelles. "There are still some things to work out," I say unnecessarily. "Smile," the treasurer shouts at the girls from the auditorium. "You're supposed to be having fun." The cheerleader quality has disappeared from her voice. Now she just sounds mean. The pageant always has a theme. This year, it's Egyptian. I don't know whose idea this was. The contestants are wearing their group dance costumes for the first time. Shiny gold leotards, black sarongs, bangle bracelets. The leotards are flimsy and unforgiving, a loud disaster for anyone who wears larger than a B-cup bra. Luckily, most of the dance moves are stiff poses. Beneath the sarongs, they wear nude-colored pantyhose, which look alien on almost everyone. White canvas sneakers detract from the overall Egyptian look. But the stage floor is full of splinters, and barefoot dancing hasn't really found a home in Southeast Guilford County. This costume can best be described as middle-aged pool partier meets a child's tap recital. The low budget may be partially to blame. When the music starts, a mid-tempo electronic beat, they lean from side to side, punctuating their sways with walk-like-an-Egyptian poses, with one arm forward, one arm behind. The girls start to move laterally in flock-like formations, as if trying to give the impression of two-dimensional hieroglyphs. I know I may be young, Britney Spears begins to narrate, but I have feelings too, and I need to do what I feel like doing. Occasionally, they hug their own bodies and face the phantom audience dead on, confronting the auditorium with images of being trapped. Their dance song is, I'm a slave for you. This was the treasurer's choice. It's hard to imagine how this can fly. These are the years before college, before cultural appropriation, Orientalism, and anti-Semitic enter my vocabulary. Still, I know enough to know all the ways this might be wrong. Maya watches them trying not to laugh. I study the side of her face. There is a faint makeup line near her jawbone, a small cluster of blemishes just below the surface. You know, she says over the music, you should have entered this year. You might have even won. They give you money, yeah? She turns to me. You could have danced or maybe played guitar. That would have been a first for them. I feel my eyebrows go up. Despite our distance from the stage, this scene feels too close for comfort. Campy pose after pose, bodies shifting inside those identical leotards. But they are all up there, the cheerleaders, the debate champion, the girl power athletes, even a few girls who are usually quite reserved. There is even the one goth kid shucking us all. We stand like this for a few minutes. I am flushed, too, as if I am also under the stage lights. The song fades out. Brittany's slinky voice evaporates into the dark. In the quiet, I am holding back something that I can't name. Maya is just behind me. She's standing so close that her shirt sleeve, a soft cotton, occasionally brushes the back of my arm. So I'm skipping forward to the last section of the essay. Pageant is like a total disaster. The weirdo that Maya and I want to win doesn't win, of course. So this is right after the pageant is over. I lift up the bottom hem of my sweater for air. In comparison to the school building, night somehow feels more like the real world. There are too many cars because of the pageant, so Maya hasn't parked in the main lot. My car is parked in Egypt, she says jokingly, her tribute to the theme of the evening. I ditch my shoes a few minutes into the walk, choosing the numbing, soggy ground over the feeling of high heels stabbing into my feet. When we get to the gravel edge of the lot, I stop. Do you want me to carry you? Maya asks, half serious. Don't be ridiculous, I say, putting my shoes on, teetering through the sinking gravel. The scene around us is like a giant X-ray. There isn't much light, but I can make out in a few places the gray edges of the rain clouds and the outlines of the trees, skeleton-like. The leaves are coming in, but we can't see them yet. We cross the ditch gurgling with rainwater and then the road. In her car, sweat pools behind my knees. I fan myself with the pageant program I am still holding. The night's humidity has caused my curls to swell up to about 3 times their normal size. I could be a beauty queen from the 1980s with this much volume. She sighs. Well, that really sucked. I thought Jamie had this thing in the bag. What did you expect? Things are changing around here, she says, hopeful. A goth was in the pageant. Maybe she just wanted to put it on her college applications, I say cynically, though I don't mean it. I'm guessing you wouldn't put it on yours, she says. Too redneck for you, yeah? She grins at me. She is kidding on one level, but she also has my number here. I'm spending this year building a road out of this county. I didn't come here tonight to support the contestants. And Maya, the only reason she was here was to help me. I suddenly feel guilty. I don't know, I say finally. We've sat idly in the car like this many times, usually because we are waiting for a good song to finish playing. But this time there is no music, and we are totally alone, far away from the girls hauling their makeup boxes and grocery store bouquets into the parking lot. Across the road, I can barely make out the baseball diamond's scoreboard, a blur of white on leggy stilts. Maya doesn't turn the ignition or even reach for her key. I look at her hard in profile, the easy curve of her forehead, the sure, undelicate nose, the small flare of her upper lip. She turns to me. As if sliding into some lateral world, I lean over the console, my mouth aiming for hers. My move is so sudden that I can hear her breath catch. She turns her head again at the last second. I'm sorry, I say. Oh, Maya laughs nervously. She pauses. It's okay, you just surprised me. I surprised myself, I wanted to say. I want to lean in again, but I've lost my nerve tonight. After a long silence, she reaches over, her hand resting on top of my knee. We wait. I put my left hand on top of hers tentatively. My fingers are not soft, I know, and I imagine she must be feeling now the place the guitar has made calloused. We sit like this for another minute, not moving. Then I reach for the back of her head, the place where her hair is the shortest. It's thicker than I expected, bristling against my hand. This texture spreads through my limbs, another sort of strangeness. It's funny, I've never found short hair attractive on a woman until just now. I trace the back of her neck and then the hard line of her jawbone. My hand crosses over intuitively to the small patch just below her ear, where blemishes from some time ago have left a mark. It's strange, this skin, a bit uneven, weathered. I think of the runway and the now empty auditorium, being stripped of its fabric and garlands. The treasurer, wondering where I am, or maybe not caring at all, is zipping her beaded dress back into its vinyl bag. I imagine her turning off the auditorium lights. Maya tilts, letting her face rest in my palm, and then turns towards me, just when I think she is going to pull away. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Henrietta, I'm looking for my direction there. Do we have time for a couple of questions before? I know there's a reception out there and people have about 5 minutes for questions. Any questions for any of the three of us? Okay, Christian will pass a mic. I'm hearing as if you guys don't get to talk to us enough.
Do I need to stand up? No? All right. That feels weird, okay. This is a question probably can be addressed to all three of us. All three of you. Have you ever run into a situation where you feel like you want to write something, but you just don't have an inspiration to start writing? What do you do when you run out of inspirations? How do you start? Thanks.
So the question is, if we want to write something, but we don't have the inspiration to write it, what do we do? I turn on Netflix. No, I mean sometimes I do. I try to find a back way into whatever it is that I'm avoiding writing about. So sometimes that means rather than tackling the subject directly, right, I'll tackle some subject that is tangential to it as a way of kind of easing myself in, right? Sometimes I also give myself an assignment, right, the way that I do for all my students.
I think that experience happened to me more when I was younger, and finding another way in is a good idea. I can't get myself sort of prompts for the sake of prompts, but I can look back through old fragments, scraps, notes of things, and begin to cobble them together in a different way, or just sit and read some poems or read something that you like and figure it might happen another day. But the more I go along, the more notes and unfinished poems and half-finished projects I have, and so there's just sort of always something else to turn to if you get frustrated and stuck on one thing. So then it becomes important to accrue those notes. Keep a notebook close, or if you want to use something on your phone, a note system, where you can build that reservoir of scraps and fragments to turn to when you're ready to start something new.
I guess I never have a shortage of things or projects that I want to write about, maybe in a similar fashion to what Hope was talking about, in that, you know, after years and years of writing, you've got all these projects that you've noted, like, I want to write a book or a story or a poem about this, you know, and you don't do the thing. So there's lots of work to be done. I personally find, you use the word inspiration, and that word, to me, personally speaking, it's a word that I don't allow myself to use. Like, if I start to lean on the idea, like, oh, like, I've got that story I want to write, but I'm not feeling inspired, I can usually cross out the word inspired and say that, like, I'm not feeling inspired, or am I feeling lazy, right? Like, to me, like, it's more about, like, sitting down and, like, doing the hard work. And that's not to say that I always do it, but I know myself well enough that if I start to be like, I'm just not feeling the inspiration today, it's because I'm feeling lazy, you know, and so I'll just go out and take a hike or something, I guess, you know, do something else and not feel guilty about it.
So all three of you had pieces of writing that were sort of centralized on a certain location. How do you find that you are able to capture a place or a time in your writing?
I guess for me, there's a great, I'll answer the question by going somewhere other than myself. There's a great conversation that you should Google between Jennifer Egan and George Saunders. And they're talking about writing science fiction in particular. Jennifer Egan's not known for writing science fiction. And I don't know if what George Saunders does is really writing science fiction. But anyway, they're talking about writing science fiction and writing historical novels, which they both recently did. And so they begin talking about, where do you start? And Saunders is all about language. He starts with the voice, and that's what drives the story. And it's like this sort of, it's the sound and the language that, like, gets him to where he's going. Jennifer Egan says that, like, she always starts with place, that, like, she enters a story through place. That's what develops the plot. That's what develops the characters. I think for myself, like, I oftentimes find myself leaning more towards the place, right? Like, I'm interested in not just, like, a certain time and or a certain set of actions, but I'm curious about, like, the place that the story is set. And so, like, that gives rise to characters and gives rise to plot.
Yeah, I love place in books and in the things that I read, and so I think that awareness of place, but through other writers and people who are telling me about places I haven't been through books, an awareness of place through talking to other people about places I love, all of that makes me more cognizant of the particular things about a place. So I just try to notice those things that make a place distinctive, and then trying to capture those in words is a challenge. So for that reason, taking notes when you travel is good, because you'll remember things that you can't quite, that are harder to summon later. Photographs are good, but they're tricky for me. They preserve things, and then I don't necessarily remember the other things that weren't in the photograph. So I have this conflicted relationship toward photographs. as an aid to helping me remember and then recreate a certain place. But it's one of the more enjoyable challenges of writing is trying to nail place.
I would say place is a major subject in all of my work. My first book of poems, part of it takes place in North Carolina and the other half in China, where I lived for some time. My new poetry book, a lot of it is taking place on Mars. I'm not kidding. In some sort of future. And then in my essays, I've written basically about all the places that I've lived. I think for me, I need to have a critical distance from a place before I can write about it. And I find myself writing about places where I'm not currently living. And I think that's because there's an act of creation, right, that goes into putting that place onto the page if I'm no longer living there, right? It becomes a creative act rather than trying to document what's actually happening or how things really are, right? It becomes sort of a creative act. And for me, I feel like that distance, the physical distance and then also the metaphorical distance, right, from the place is necessary to write about it. I don't find myself writing about places where I've actually lived or where I actually currently live, right? It's only afterwards.